Everyone in this town shares the same ancestor, DNA proved it. This town should look like any other place on the map. Different families, different histories, different origins. That's how human populations work. But when scientists mapped their DNA, something didn't just look unusual, it broke a rule biology depends on. Thousands of unrelated people, living separate lives, all traced back to a single ancestor. Not in a distant, abstract way, but in a pattern so tight, so recent, it shouldn't exist. Because for this to be true, history would have had to follow a path no one recorded, and no one remembered. At first, the town did not attract attention for anything extraordinary. It was small, stable, and culturally unremarkable, exactly the kind of place geneticists rarely focus on. The study itself was routine. Researchers were not looking for a mystery. They were collecting baseline data, trying to understand how regional populations evolve over time. Samples were taken quietly, methodically, without expectation. The assumption was simple: like every other population, this one would show a mix of lineages, fragments of migrations, traces of ancient interconnections. That is how human DNA usually behaves: layered, diverse, unpredictable. But when the first results came in, the pattern was too clean. Instead of diversity, there was repetition. Instead of variation, there was alignment. At first, it looked like an error, something in the sequencing process, a contamination, a computational mistake. Because what the data suggested was not just unlikely. It was structurally wrong. The genetic markers did not scatter across different ancestral branches the way they should. They converged. Again and again. Toward a single origin point. The team did what scientists always do when something looks impossible. They checked the machines. They reran the analysis. They compared results across independent labs. But the outcome did not change. If anything, it became clearer. Beneath the surface differences, names, appearances, family stories, there was a shared signature embedded in their DNA. A signature that pointed backward, not to a population, but to an individual. The first explanation seemed almost reasonable. Isolation. If a community remains cut off long enough, its genetic pool can narrow. Over generations, certain traits become more common, certain lineages dominate. It has happened before in remote islands, in mountain villages, in places where migration slows to a halt. So the researchers looked into the town's history. Was it isolated? Had it been cut off geographically or culturally? But the records told a different story. Trade routes had passed nearby. People had moved in and out over centuries. There was no evidence of the kind of long-term isolation required to produce such a uniform pattern. And even if there had been, isolation alone does not compress ancestry into a single line. It reduces diversity, but it does not erase it. There should still have been multiple ancestors, multiple genetic threads weaving through the population. What they were seeing was something else entirely. It was as if, at some point in the past, all those threads had been pulled together, collapsed into one, and then spread outward again without losing that central imprint. This is where the mystery deepened. Because DNA does not just record who we come from. It records how populations move, split, merge, and evolve. It carries the memory of migrations, conflicts, unions, and separations. It is, in a sense, a biological archive. And in this archive, entire chapters were missing. The expected branching patterns were not there. The usual signs of mixture and divergence had been replaced by something far more controlled, almost deliberate. As the researchers expanded their analysis, they began to focus on specific markers, segments of DNA that are passed down with minimal change. These markers are often used to trace lineage because they act like stable anchors across generations. And in this town, those anchors all pointed in the same direction. Not just broadly, but precisely. The estimated time to the most recent common ancestor was not thousands of years ago, as it often is in large populations. It was much closer. Uncomfortably close. That created a contradiction no one could ignore. For thousands of people to share a single recent ancestor, there would need to have been an event, something powerful enough to reshape the entire genetic structure of the population. But there was no record of such an event. No mass migration, no documented bottleneck, no catastrophe that could have reduced the population to a handful of individuals and then rebuilt it. And yet, the DNA insisted. Some researchers began to consider a second possibility. Not isolation, but selection. What if, at some point, a specific lineage had been favored socially, culturally, or even biologically? Over time, that lineage could expand, gradually dominating the genetic landscape. It would not erase other lines completely, but it could make one origin disproportionately common. There are historical precedents for this. Certain powerful individuals have left outsized genetic legacies due to influence, status, or circumstance. But again, the data resisted this explanation. The dominance was too complete. Too uniform. It was not just that one lineage was common, it was that alternative lineages were almost absent. As if they had never been there to begin with. Or had been removed in a way that left no trace. By now, the investigation had moved beyond routine science. The team began collaborating with historians, anthropologists, even statisticians, trying to understand not just the data, but the absence within the data. Because sometimes, what is missing tells you more than what is present. And that is when a third, more unsettling idea began to emerge. What if the town had not evolved in the way we assume populations do? What if, instead of gradually forming through countless independent lineages, it had originated from a single, concentrated source, and then expanded rapidly, in a way that compressed generations into a shorter span of time? This would not just challenge historical records. It would challenge the underlying assumptions about how human populations grow and diversify. To test this, researchers turned to advanced modeling. They simulated different scenarios. Isolated growth, selective expansion, population bottlenecks, trying to recreate the pattern they were seeing. But none of the standard models fit. No matter how they adjusted the variables, the simulations always produced more diversity than the real data showed. It was as if the town had followed a path no model could predict. Then came the breakthrough that shifted everything. A deeper analysis of the DNA did not just look at ancestry, it looked at mutation rates. Tiny changes that accumulate over generations, acting like a clock. By measuring these changes, scientists can estimate how much time has passed between ancestors and descendants. And in this case, the clock revealed something unexpected. The rate of variation was lower than it should have been. Not just slightly. Significantly. This suggested that the population had not just shared a common ancestor, it had done so in a compressed time frame. As if the usual spread of generations had been accelerated or constrained in a way that limited genetic divergence. And that is where the story begins to shift from history into something more complex. Because if the timeline itself does not behave as expected, then the question is no longer just who the ancestor was. It becomes something deeper. What kind of process could produce a population where diversity does not expand the way it should? What mechanism could hold a genetic signature so tightly across so many individuals? The answer, if there is one, does not sit neatly in a single field. It lies somewhere between biology, history, and something we do not fully understand yet. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: the people living in the town had no idea. Their lives were ordinary. Their stories felt personal, independent, separate. And yet, beneath all of that, they were connected in a way that challenges the very idea of individuality. Imagine discovering that your ancestry does not branch outward into countless unknown paths, but instead folds inward, toward a single point. A single life, somewhere in the past, that echoes through everyone around you. The research is still ongoing. The data is still being analyzed. But one thing has already become clear. This is not just a story about a town. It is a question about how we understand human history itself. Because if one population can carry such a pattern, unnoticed for so long, then it raises a possibility we are not entirely prepared to confront. What if this is not unique? What if there are other places, other populations, where the same hidden structure exists, waiting to be uncovered? The research is still ongoing, and the deeper scientists went, the less this looked like a normal population and the more it started to resemble something structured, almost controlled, in a way no one had expected at the beginning of the study. So they changed their approach completely, moving away from broad patterns and focusing instead on individual genetic pathways, tracing each person's lineage step by step, generation by generation, trying to find even the smallest deviation that could break the idea of a single shared origin, because in any natural population, variation always exists, even in the most isolated communities. But here, no matter how far they traced, no matter how many family trees they reconstructed, every path kept circling back to the same point of origin, as if all roads in this town, both historically and biologically, had been designed to lead to one place. At that point, the investigation expanded beyond the town itself, because if this ancestor truly existed, there should have been some trace of them outside, some distant genetic echo in neighboring regions or even in global databases, since human populations are constantly mixing over time. So the researchers compared the town's DNA against millions of samples from different parts of the world, expecting at least a faint match somewhere, a diluted version of the same lineage appearing in another population. But the result was deeply unsettling, because there was no meaningful match at all, no clear external connection, no gradual fading of the lineage as distance increased. Instead, the genetic signature seemed locked within the town, as if it had grown inward rather than outward, expanding without spreading, which is not how ancestry normally behaves. This forced scientists to consider a far more unusual possibility, that the ancestor they were tracing was not simply part of the population's past but the starting point of the population as it currently exists, meaning that instead of many lineages blending together over time, this community may have expanded from a single genetic source in a way that compressed diversity rather than increasing it. To explore this, they analyzed recombination patterns, the way DNA fragments mix and break apart across generations, because normally, the longer a population exists, the more fragmented these patterns become. But in this case, the fragments were unusually large and intact, suggesting fewer generational splits than expected, almost as if time, in a biological sense, had moved differently for this group compared to the rest of humanity. This contradiction between recorded history and genetic evidence became impossible to ignore, because on paper, the town had a long, continuous past, with documented families, migrations, and social changes stretching back centuries, yet the DNA told a much shorter and more unified story, one that did not reflect the complexity that should have developed over that period. So researchers went back to the historical records, not looking for obvious errors, but for subtle inconsistencies, and that is when they began to notice patterns that had previously seemed insignificant, repeated names appearing across different time periods without clear generational gaps, families emerging in records without well-defined origins, and certain lineages appearing in multiple places at once in ways that did not fully align with normal inheritance patterns. Individually, these details could be explained away, but together they formed a picture that suggested something had interrupted the natural flow of the town's development, something that had reshaped its population structure in a way that was no longer visible in written history but was still preserved in the DNA. And then came a small but critical discovery, buried in local archives, where several independent documents referenced a particular lineage that appeared consistently across different eras, not as a dominant ruling family, but as a quiet, recurring presence connected to many others, almost like a thread woven through the entire fabric of the town. At first, this seemed like the missing piece, a lineage that had gradually expanded and influenced the population over time, but when scientists compared those records with the genetic data, the alignment was not exact, because the DNA pattern did not show a gradual spread from one family outward. Instead, it appeared as if the entire population already carried that signature from the beginning of the measurable timeline. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything, because it suggests that the process was not one of influence or dominance, but of origin. At this stage, one of the more controversial theories began to take shape, that at some point in the past, the population experienced an extreme genetic bottleneck so complete that nearly all alternative lineages disappeared, leaving only one to continue forward. But even this explanation has limitations, because known bottlenecks still leave behind traces of diversity and irregularity, whereas this pattern remains unusually consistent, almost too consistent for a purely natural event. It does not show the randomness expected from survival under pressure, but rather a kind of uniformity that is difficult to attribute to chance alone. So the question shifts again, away from what happened, and toward how it could have happened in such a precise way, and this is where the limits of current understanding begin to appear, because none of the existing models of population genetics fully recreate what is being observed here. Every simulation produces more variation than the real data shows, every historical analogy falls slightly short, and every explanation leaves a gap that cannot be completely closed. And that is what makes this case different from a typical scientific mystery, because instead of moving toward a clear answer, it seems to move in the opposite direction, revealing more structure as it goes, but not more clarity. The town is still there, its people still living ordinary lives, unaware that beneath their individual identities lies a connection that challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about human history, that we come from many lines, not one. Imagine realizing that your entire community, every face you see, every family you know, is tied back to a single life, a single point in time that somehow expanded into everything around you, not gradually, not visibly, but in a way that left almost no trace except in the code of your DNA. It does not change how you live day to day, but it changes how you understand where you come from, and perhaps more importantly, how unique that origin really is. Because if this can happen here, in one small town that no one thought to question, then it raises a possibility that extends far beyond it, a possibility that somewhere else, in another place just as ordinary, the same pattern might exist, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice that what looks like many, might actually begin with one. If you want to see how far this mystery goes and what scientists might uncover next, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments, because the next part of this story may change the way we understand human origins even further.